Hi guys, it's Lizzie from the Academy team and welcome back to part 3 of our Photography Basics series. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the camera's shutter, what it is, what it does, and how you'd control it. Let's take a quick recap of part 2, where we took a look at the lens's aperture. What we discovered was that it's what many photographers use to control their depth of field, or how much of their image is in focus. And that's by changing the size of the aperture, which also then controls how much light passes through the lens. So the next part of our journey of light, once it's passed through the aperture, it hits the camera's shutter. The easy way to think of the shutter is like a blind in front of a window, which opens and closes at different speeds. Here on this old film camera, we can actually see the shutter opening and closing at different speeds. And this is no different to those found on a modern digital camera. But of course, instead of the film sitting behind the shutter, we can see the camera's sensor. Now, just like the aperture, there is a scale involved to measure how quickly or slowly the shutter opens and closes. Rather than f-stops, this time it's a little bit easier. It's just fractions of time. We start here with a very fast shutter speed of 8 thousandths of a second and 4 thousandths of a second and so on, until you get right down here to 30 whole seconds. Now remember back to part 2 of this series when we spoke about light being measured in stops? There were full stops of light and third stops of light. Shutter speeds get measured in the same way. Here between 1/8 thousandths of a second and 4 thousandths of a second is one full stop of light. And between each of those full stops, we can see those third stops. Unlike aperture, where your settings were limited by the type of lens you had, with shutter speeds you've got a lot more to play around with. In fact, the scale keeps going and going right down to the bottom here where you can see this inch symbol, and that just stands for seconds. So how do we change our shutter? Well, on our camera's main control wheel at the top here, we just want to move across to the S mode. Or if you're using Canon, it would be TV. Now TV just stands for time value, and that's just the wording they use to describe shutter priority. Once you've done this, you will now find yourself in shutter priority mode, where you will have full control over your shutter speed. The camera, however, will look after everything else, so that it can balance the other options to try and get you a reasonably exposed image. You can change your shutter speed using the selector wheel that sits by your forefinger at the front or the wheel at the back of your camera near your thumb. Just like aperture, shutter speeds are not just used to balance your exposure. They are in fact used for creative effect. Fast shutter speeds freeze any moving action, very useful for wildlife and sports photographers who need to freeze the action of fast-moving people or animals. Slower shutter speeds can be used for both creative and artistic effects. They're a big hit with landscape photographers who love to get that movement in water and skies. Here in these two images, you can see the difference and impact that slowing down our shutter speed has had to the way the image is communicated. It now tells a very different story. It is worth pointing out that when you're using a slower shutter speed, as you can see here on this diagram, anything in the orange is what we'd consider slow for most cameras and most people. And I say most people because it depends on how steady you can hold your camera, and that obviously varies from person to person. Now the other thing to say is that while slow shutter speeds are great for slowing down things that you're looking at, it can also have an impact if you yourself are moving or wobbling while you're taking the shot. You can sometimes end up with quite a blurry image which doesn't really look very nice. Now don't worry, because there is a simple way that you can compensate for that, and that is by popping your camera on a tripod or a steady surface. Now you don't need to go off and buy the most expensive or biggest tripod available. All you need to do is check that the tripod you're looking at can take the weight of your camera and the biggest lens that you're going to be using. Now another technique with shutter speeds is something called a pan shot, and I've got a photo here which was taken by our resident motorsports photographer, Pete. Now you might notice that the background is all blurry on this picture, but the racing car, or the foreground, is all nice and sharp, and that's exactly the result you'd want from a panning shot. Now it's tempting to think that this photo was taken with a faster shutter speed, but it's actually not. It would be a medium to slow shutter speed, and the motion blur in the background is achieved through this technique called panning. Here's a little demonstration of a panning shot. So I'm going to need your imagination to work with me right now, but let's imagine I'm standing on the side of a road and there is a car that's driving past me. So what I want to do is pop the camera to my face, and I just want to track or follow along that car as it moves past. Ideally, I want to be matching its speed. So here we go. The car is coming. I am finger on the shutter, ready to take a photo. And as it goes past me, I am going to track or pan along with it. Okay, so one more time, I'm going to pan with the car and I am going to be matching its speed. Now, all the while, I'm going to be taking a succession of photos. So it is worth popping your camera into continuous or burst mode to be able to do this. That way you just need to hold your finger on the shutter, pan along, and it will just go snap, 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 snap. And you should end up with a photo that you're after. But that is a pretty poor example of how you would take a panning shot and how you would get that nice motion blur to the background of your image, but a really sharp foreground object. Okay, so challenge time for me, and I am going to freeze the action of this water balloon popping. So here we go, continuous shoot mode, 5/100ths of a second, and a nice splashy water balloon. So that brings us to the end of part 3 of our photography basics series. Stay tuned for part 4, where we'll be talking about all things ISO. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give us a like. Don't forget to hit subscribe and smash that bell icon so you can stay up to date on all of our latest content. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you on the next one.